Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good day. Today, we will discuss of the European Union roles in multilateralism and global governance, with special focus on how the EU navigate world increasingly shaped by unilateralisms, fragmented global institutions, and diverging great power strategies. We will structure this lecture into four main parts. First, we will start with the understanding of the concept of multilateralism. And second, we will discuss about the EU's identity as multilateral actors. And third, we will discuss its actual practice in the global governance. And fourth, we will discuss contemporary challenge and criticism to the EU multilateralism. First, let's start it with what is multilateralism. Multilateralism, as defined by Raji and Keohane, refers to the coordinations of policies among three or more states on the basis of generalized principles and norms. It is rules-based form of cooperations that favor diffuse reciprocities, meaning states cooperate not for immediate benefits, but because of long-term mutual gains. Importantly, multilateralisms differ from bilateralism, where states pursue one-on-one deals prioritizing short-term gains, or multipolarities, which involve power balancing rather than shared rule making. As we can see from post World War II multilateralism, there are already several examples. Let's say the United Nations, the IMF, WTO was designed by hegemonic powers, particularly the United States, but was increasingly shaped by actors like the European Union. Now let's see how the EU as a multilateral actors. The EU is a model of institutionalized multilateralism, internally and externally. Internally, the EU has developed supranational structures, such as European Commissions, which is already above a member state, Court of Justice, and the Eurozone, that require coordination diverse state with commitment to shared norms. Externally, the EU also pursue what it calls effective multilateralism, which is centered on first strengthening the international law and institutions, second, promoting peace, rule of law, and human rights, third, supporting global public goods such as sustainable development. The European Security Strategy, or ESS, underlined this commitment, positioning the EU as civilian power and normative actors, focus more on diplomacy and cooperation than military interventions. Now let's see its practice in the global governance. The EU has two phases in the global governance. First, as a model, which is inspiring regional integrations in other parts of the world, such as ASEAN in Southeast Asia or Mercosur in Latin America. Second, as an actor, the EU also engaging in multilateral diplomacy, contributing peacekeeper and leading in environmental governance. However, if we look at and observe in a more in depth, we will witness or see that its influence varies depending on the institutional setting. Let's say, for example, in the UN bodies, the EU often speaks with one voice, but its internal coordination is very complex. While on developmental aid and trade policies, it's more likely reflects a value like democracy and human rights, but also we can see that it imposing European preference on others. Importantly, we see in the EU often seek to act as a bridge builder between the global South concern and Western liberal norms, but this is not always welcome. Some actors perceive EU initiative as failed attempt to assert dominance via norms rather than powers. Now let's take a look on the challenge and the critics of EU multilateralism. Despite its commitment, EU multilateralism faced three major challenges. The first one is internal fragmentation. It's the lack of single coherent foreign policy voice weakened the EU's credibility. Like, for example, in the Iraq War was a key moment of division in European Union. External power shifts is also a challenge for EU. The return of great power competitions like the United States unilateralism or Chinese assertiveness and Russia's veto to the UN make multilateralism harder to implement. And also the last one is trust deficit. The EU normative power is often questioned by the global south, especially when conditionalities are attached to aid or trade. Robert Kiyosaki even argued that EU effort at multilateralism may inadvertently harm multilateral institutions when they are perceived as self-serving. Now, I want to bring out some case studies comparisons to have more concrete illustrations of the EU multilateralism. Let's start with comparing the EU multilateralism with the US and China. Let's now contrast the EU multilateral approach with the other major global powers here, the United States and China, to better understand what makes the EU distinct in the global governance. The United States, from leadership to selective engagement, historically, the post-World War II multilateral order was shaped under US hegemony, embedding liberal principles like free trade, open institutions, and human rights. But in recent decades, particularly after 9/11, the US has demonstrated a more unilateral and preemptive stance, especially during the Bush administrations. The US opted out of resistant multilateral framework like Kyoto Protocol, the International Criminal Court, and the UN reform agenda. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, for example, despite lack of UN support, highlight this shift and trigger transatlantic divisions. We also can still see this kind of unilateralism from the US even under the Trump administrations. By contrast, the EU doubled down on effective multilateralisms. We're still trying to emphasizing diplomacy's international law institutions like the UN as a default tools of actions, even though these kind of effective multilateralisms is still now facing a lot of criticism, especially from the global south countries. But let's take a look on China as a strategic multilateralism. China presents a different case. It engaged in what scholars call selective or instrumental multilateralism. Unlike the EU, China does not aim to universalize values through norms. Yes, I have a bit of a problem with the camera. Let me try to fix it. Okay. So again, I will repeat, China presents a different case. It engaged in what scholars call selective or instrumental multilateralism, participate actively in multilateral institutions. Sorry, I have here. So yeah, China participate actively in multilateral institutions like the UN, WTO, or G20, but often to protect sovereignty and limit Western interference in domestic affairs. China tried to promote win-win cooperations, but resists legalistic norms tied to liberal values such as human rights and environmental accountabilities. Unlike the EU, China does not aim to universalize values through norm. Its Belt and Road Initiative, for example, engage multilateral with partners, but often on bilateral terms, prioritizing infrastructure and influence without normative conditionalities. Now let's take a look at the EU as in contrast to both, which is normative and post-Westphalian actors. Let's see. The US promote rules but often exempt itself. China follow rules when it aligns with national interests, but resists intrusive norms. The EU, however, embraces normativity as identity. It advocates a post-sovereign and post-national approach where sovereignty is shared and where law, not power, govern international relations. This distinctiveness, as Ian Manner called, position the EU as normative power, using civilian instrument and moral persuasions rather than military force or strategic coercions. However, there is a limit to this EU exceptionalism. First, this commitment also exposed the EU to critique. The Global South often perceived EU conditionality as norm imperialism, where EU used this norm to control or dominate the agenda of global agenda, or in particular, the agenda in the Global South. Unlike the US or China, the EU also lacks of coercive instrument and relies heavily on consensus, which can delay actions. Now let's take a look in a more issue-based, which is the EU multilateralism and global environmental governance. One of the clearest arena where the EU multilateralism ethos intersect with policy is global environmental governance, especially climate change. A norm-driven environmental actors, EU positions itself as green leader in multilateral forum like UN Framework Conventions on Climate Change, or we also know it as Paris Agreement, and also in the Kyoto Protocol. EU consistently push for legally binding international agreement, ambitious target for emission reductions, climate justice, technology transfer, and support for vulnerable countries. This stems from its self-image as normative power that use rules, not force, to shape global outcome. Let's take a look one by one. EU and the Kyoto Protocol. EU was instrumental in salvaging the Kyoto Protocol after the US withdrew under the Bush administrations. In doing so, it reinforced its commitment to multilateral framework, even when major power abandoned them. A form of climate unilateralism by others met with normative multilateralism by the EU. By committing to binding reductions target, setting up its emission trading scheme or ETS, and funding climate adaptations abroad, the EU aimed to lead by example, a hallmark of its environmental diplomacy. Others example is Paris Agreement and beyond. In the Paris Agreement, EU played a key brokering role, advocating differentiated responsibility with universal commitment, strong monitoring and transparency framework, global finance mechanism for climate mitigation and adaptations. The other one is the EU Green Deal diplomacy, and the Fit for 55 package also extend its multilateral push into trade and development, using tools like carbon border adjustment to encourage global compliance. But also this sort of like role of EU in global environmental governance also comes with tensions and critics. Like, for example, some global South countries see EU environmental standard as non-tariff barrier or green protectionism. The other criticism is EU climate aid is still insufficient or conditional. Internally, member state divisions and lobbying by fossil fuel sectors can dilute the EU coherence. Despite this challenge, environmental diplomacy remains central to the EU multilateral identity. It showcases a commitment to global public goods, effort to shape norms and rules multilaterally, and aspirations to reconcile internal governance with external leadership. This environmental multilateralism reflects EU broader project to be post-sovereign actors that solve global problems through institutions and norms, not coercions or isolations. Now, we've seen throughout today's lecture, the European Union positioned itself as a champion of rule-based international orders, rooted in multilateral cooperations, norm settings, and institutional engagement. Whether in trade, peacekeeping, or climate policy, the EU seeks to shape global governance not through dominance but through examples. Yet, the path forward is neither straightforward nor guaranteed. As unilateralism research in this global politics and power dynamics shift globally, the EU role is now being tested. Its legitimacy is often questioned, its coherent challenged, and its normative power at times misunderstood or resisted. So, the final questions I leave you with is: can the EU sustain its role as a credible and effective multilateral actors in a world that increasingly privilege hard power, bilateral deal, and strategic competitions? Do you think the EU still be credible champion of multilateralism when key global actors move away from it? I invite you to reflect on this, not just a questions of policy, but of values, identity, and global citizenship. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions in class.